Hello, this is my video on the geography of ancient Greece for Great Book students. Traveling is a great delight, and particularly for Great Book students. I'll have to say, the material that you read in Great Books class is exceptional. It is oftentimes material that other people are frightened of reading, and you have taken up the task of actually plowing into these wonderful texts and have done the hard work to go through them, and now you have the benefit of being able to travel and see the things that relate to what we have read. The great books are not an easy read, but after reading through them, you have a whole world open to you that is going to be fascinating and captivating for you to dive into. The world of travel is just exactly that. You are going to be able to see places that relate to what we have read in ways that will illuminate what we've studied and provide you with a fascinating experience to be able to make your education that much deeper. One of the things I loved about my own childhood was that my parents loved to travel, and they loved to go to Europe, they loved to see history, and they took great delight in it. And though I was not always a willing traveler in my younger years, I grew up seeing these places and being able to relate to what we saw in history through the actual places. And that was very valuable. And I've always wanted to share that same experience with my students, and think it's very valuable to have the opportunity to go together and to learn by seeing things in person. On day one, we will be traveling from the United States and landing in Athens. On day two, we'll start out right with the big sites in downtown Athens. Here is where are most of the sites that relate to what we've read, as Athens is a very important city in Greek history. First, we'll be going to the Acropolis. Now, you have to understand the word Acropolis simply means top of the city, and this is first where the Athenians built their fort, where they would defend themselves from the other warring Greek states. And as you'll notice, it's just a great big large rock outcrop. Now, on top of the Acropolis, we'll be seeing the Parthenon. Now, this is actually the Parthenon that was built after the Parthenon that was destroyed by the Persians was rebuilt under the Athenian leader Pericles. And there's actually a wonderful story in that, as if you go to the north wall of the Acropolis, you will see drums that are actually from the first Parthenon that was built on the Acropolis. These drums are actually placed into the wall of the Acropolis to remind people of the sacrilege that the Persians committed when they burnt down the first Parthenon. Temples were to be respected, and the Persians, in burning down the Athenian temples, marked themselves forever as being a sacrilegious people. The Parthenon itself is an amazing piece of architecture. It was built by Pericles with the monies that had been gathered from the other allies in the Delian League after the Persian War. And though the Athenians were supposed to be taking those monies and building up Greek defenses against the Persians, they had enough money left over that they thought that they would do a little civic beautification, and so they built the Parthenon with it. The Parthenon itself is a bit of a symbol of Athenian oppression over the other cities in the Delian League. However, it is an architectural masterpiece. Money well spent. And many of the amazing features of the Acropolis are the fact that it simply has no straight lines in it. All of the lines have been counterbalanced against our natural tendency to see straight lines as curved, so that as you look back at the Parthenon from a distance, those straight lines even out and actually look straight. It's a really amazing bit of architectural sleight of hand in order to make this building look particularly perfect. Standing opposite the Parthenon is the Erechtheion. Now, the Erechtheion was another one of the Athenian temples, like the Parthenon, and also factored into their religious festivals, but it's not nearly as famous as the Parthenon. However, it is known for the beautiful ladies that have been carved into the pillars on the side porch. Now, just down from the Acropolis, we have the Areopagus. Now, this is not only a classical site, but a biblical site as well, for you know the Apostle Paul came and preached here to the Athenians when he was coming through Athens and exhorted them to follow the unknown God. The Areopagus, or as it was called Mars Hill, was a place of gathering for philosophers. However, it was also where the Persians camped their army while they lay siege to the Acropolis during the Persian War. Down from the Areopagus is the ancient Agora. This is the marketplace. The Acropolis was originally the fort and where they had their temples and their treasury, and then down in the lower area is where they did their daily commerce. In the ancient Agora, this is the area where Socrates spent his time wandering around, talking with people, carrying on conversations, and basically encouraging Athenian ill will by all of his uncomfortable questions. Next to the ancient agora is the Temple of Hephaestus. The Temple of Hephaestus is very well preserved and gives you a better idea as to what the Parthenon would have looked like if it had not been exploded during the war between the Turks and the Phoenicians. Also in the area of the ancient agora is the Stoa of Attalos. The Stoa of Attalos has actually been rebuilt by the American School of Archaeology, and in ancient times it was a marketplace and a place to simply gather to meet your friends and discuss, and this is where Socrates also spent a good deal of time discussing with his friends. However, today it's a wonderful museum, and this museum is full of wonderful artifacts. You'll find there the little jars that were used in executions for holding the hemlock, also many ostracons that are used for the ostracism of various Athenian leaders, as well as a very fine pottery collection and armor. The ancient agora is actually where the original theater was, where the plays that we read in class were most likely originally performed, plays by Sophocles and Aeschylus. However, on the other side of the Acropolis is the later theater, which is much fancier. This is the theater of Dionysus, and much of this theater is still there, and many of the seats in the front, which have lovely carving on them, have still been preserved. These are the seats for dignitaries and priests that would come and watch the plays. On day 3, we'll begin by going to the Acropolis Museum. The Acropolis Museum is a new museum in Athens and is used to store many of the statues that had originally been on the Acropolis itself. The environment of Athens has lots of smog, and so they try to take the statues as much as they can out of the open air and store them in museums. And here in the Acropolis Museum, they have a wonderful storehouse of many, many very fine statues. And so in the Acropolis Museum, you have the original from the porch on the Erechtheion, and those are stored very carefully here. In the Acropolis Museum, you have the friezes that actually portray the events such as the battle with the centaurs. Also here in the Acropolis Museum, you do have some models of the figures that were in the pediment of the Parthenon. However, the originals are in London, so the Greeks would like the British to give them back, but that doesn't appear to be happening anytime soon. Now, after the Acropolis Museum, we'll be going to the National Archaeological Museum. This museum really has many of the finest of Athens' archaeological finds, particularly those from Mycenae. And there's not really a very extensive museum at Mycenae. However, here you can see many of the very old artifacts that were gotten from Mycenae and from that Mycenaean period. Many of them are quite ornate. A lot of them have lots of gold involved in them. And you'll see there's a different style that they carry from the art that we find from the classical period of Athens. Here in the National Archaeological Museum, you also have art from Crete, which is very interesting because it is another time period that has a different look to it as well. Before the days of Athens and Sparta, you had the Mycenaean Empire, and even before the Mycenaean Empire, you had the Minoan Empire. And that empire, too, has a whole different flavor and style to it that's really lovely to get to see. On day 4, we'll be leaving Athens and heading off to Corinth. And first, we will come to the Corinthian Canal. The Corinthian Canal was built in the 1800s. However, this is also the area that is known as the Isthmus. And we know that from Herodotus because, if you remember, the Spartans were actually planning to build their wall of defense against the invading Persians here at this isthmus. And so this is very close to the area where the Spartans would have been planning to make that defense. After seeing the isthmus, we'll be going to the ancient city of Corinth itself. And this, once again, is a city that has both classical and biblical significance. If you remember, the Corinthians were very oftentimes siding with the Spartans against the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War. And this is also where the Apostle Paul visits and writes the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There are many places here that are of significance to the Apostle Paul's journey: the Agora of Corinth, the Temple of Apollo that he mentions, the Roman Odeon, the Bema and Gallio's seat. All of these things factor into Paul's time here in Corinth, and our guide is very good at showing all of those as well. After seeing ancient Corinth, we will go on to the sanctuary of Epidaurus. Now, Epidaurus was a sanctuary of healing. However, they also had a theater there. For some reason, this theater saw very little deterioration over time, and today is one of the best preserved in all of the Mediterranean. So, getting to see the theater here is a wonderful introduction to an understanding of ancient theater. you'll be able to see very distinctly the acoustics of this theater, which really are quite stunning. If you stand down in the middle of this theater and somebody sits way up in the top seat, and you speak using just a normal speaking voice, the person will be able to understand you. Now, your voice doesn't sound loud to them, but it is very clear. And so it's just the shape of the theater being designed as it was really quite capable of a very large audience being able to hear these actors down on the stage without any of the advantages of our modern amplification. After seeing Epidaurus, we'll be going down to where we'll spend the night in the beautiful little seaside city of Erechtheion. Not a whole lot here that relates to our Great Books experience. There is a wonderful Venetian fort at the top of the hill, but also a very good gelato shop, which I'm sure you'll want to see as well. On day 5, we will be traveling to Mycenae, which is the city of Agamemnon. Now, there were many skeptics who didn't even think that there really was a historical Agamemnon, but due to the archaeological work of the pioneering archaeologist Erechtheion, he actually found the city of Mycenae, and many of the characteristics match up with Homer's description of Agamemnon, and most scholars today believe, primarily because of Schliemann's work, that there really was a historical Agamemnon. The walls of this Mycenaean palace are called Cyclopean, and when you go, you'll understand why, as the stones in these walls are huge. Most of them the size of a minivan, some of them the size of a school bus. And you look at these stones and you have to just wonder how anyone was able to move these into place. A particularly impressive one is in what's called the tomb of Agamemnon. This stone is absolutely gargantuan. Now, the curious thing about this is that they have done tests on these stones and found that the stones do not come from the immediate location. They come from 3 or 4 miles away. And this is up a mountainside. Now, how these ancient people were able to move these stones up mountains and over valleys really is a stunning question. Now, I can assure you there are no space aliens involved, and that should not be your answer. However, let me just give you another interesting comparison for the capacities of ancient people. Now, I'm going to jump over to Babylonian history here because there's a very interesting bit of Babylonian mathematical history, and that's on a particular tablet called Plimpton 322. Now, Plimpton 322 is an ancient cuneiform Babylonian tablet that records Pythagorean triples. All right? Now, if you know the Pythagorean formula, you know that there are particular sequences that fulfill that formula and make it work. For example, 3, 4, and 5. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, and so that's a Pythagorean triple that works. Now, there are lots of number combinations that don't work, but there are many that do. And finding those combinations of numbers has always been one of the quests of mathematicians. Well, the Babylonians, on this tablet, Plimpton 322, give Pythagorean triples into the hundreds of thousands. Now, to imagine how you calculate and find Pythagorean triples in over 100,000 simply blows your mind. All right, it is simply not a matter that you can calculate by, simple hunt and peck. And being that they don't have any calculators, this would take a very long time. And you think about it, the only way that you can derive these Pythagorean triples is to come up with formulas that will actually find them. Well, in the West, we were not able to come up with the formulas again until about 1600. So it's about 3,600 years after the Babylonians showed they have the capacity, the Europeans find these formulas again. And so it's simply boggling as to what the ancients were able to do. And standing in front of the tomb of Agamemnon and looking up at this large stone, you will be completely humbled to realize that these people who so long ago had such advanced capabilities. So maybe there were space aliens involved, I don't know. On day 6, we'll be traveling on to Olympia. This, of course, is very famous for the Olympics. However, there's many things here besides the Olympics to see. Olympia was a place of worship where many objects were sent out of thanks to the gods. And one of the most amazing things that they have here is a helmet that the general Miltiades sent to the Temple of Olympia after his victory at Marathon. items like this of such specific historical importance to actually have preserved is really quite stunning. It's a little bit like having one of the stones that the boy David had in his sling when he slew Goliath, something like that. It's just that sort of specific moments in history. Also, you have here the great temple of Zeus, and the temple of Zeus was built by the great sculptor Phidias, who actually had a workshop on site, and they know the site of that workshop, and very curiously even found a cup that had his name on it. So if you know the great work of the sculptor Phidias, to also have his specific location here is quite fascinating. Olympia will also give you an opportunity to see the great importance that sports held in ancient Greek life. You'll see all of the various training rooms and facilities that they had to make sure that their athletes were actually in top shape, and also the stadium itself, where if you're strong and brave enough, you too can line up at that starting line and see if you are indeed worthy of Olympic glory. Day 6 will be traveling to Delphi. However, on our way, we'll be passing the suspension bridge going between the Peloponnesian Peninsula and the Greek mainland. And though this has no ancient significance, it is a very cool bridge to be able to see. We'll be traveling up the mountainside to Delphi, where we will see the many treasuries that were located there at Delphi. You have to understand Delphi was a religious center for the Greeks, and very oftentimes at religious centers they would put their treasuries, as it was considered absolutely unexpected that anyone would dare to steal from a sacred site. Also here at Delphi you have the Omphalos. The Omphalos is what the ancients believed to be the center of the world. And so here you can see the center of the world. Today this is actually located in Escondido, right in front of Mr. Hendricks' hall, and you can see that when you come to class sometime. Why it moved, I'm not really sure, but it's here. Now, also, you will see in Delphi the Archaeological Center. There's a lot of wonderful artifacts here as well. You will see the statues of Cleobus and Biton. As you remember from Herodotus, the two very pious young men who carried their mother in the cart all the way to the temple and were given the great gift of dying without any misery having come into their lives. Also at Delphi, we have the stadium. At most of the ancient religious centers, there were also stadiums because they were centers of games as well. And it's also important to remember that there were many oracles in the ancient world. Delphi was certainly the most influential. And if you look at ancient Greek civilization, you find that most of the cities that the Greeks inhabited were centered around Delphi. And so they almost consciously tried to find places to live where they could come back to the Delphic oracle. If you remember, probably the most famous incident we have of the Delphic oracle is its very confusing statement made to Croesus. If you remember, Croesus sent a messenger to the Delphic oracle and asked if he should go to war against Persia. And the Delphic oracle responded that if he does, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus, being a fairly confident fellow, assumed that would be the Persian Empire. Unfortunately for him, that was an incorrect assumption. Also shows you the benefit of the follow-up question whenever you get a statement from the oracle. Delphi itself is a simply gorgeous setting. It's up on the side of a mountain, and as you wander around the ruins, you can look out over the valley and see the wonderful Amphissa olive groves that grow in this area. It's quite lovely, and being there is just a wonderful mountaintop experience itself. On day 8, we'll be traveling north quite far, going up to the city of Kalambaka, where we have the site of Meteora. Meteora is not a site having to do with classical history, but rather medieval history, as this is the area where many of the Christian monks founded their monasteries. It's a combination of both the attempt to find Christian isolation for study, for reflection and prayer, as well as some amazing geography. In the area of Meteora, they have these very, very tall geological formations of stone that stick straight up in the air. And the monks took advantage of these and built small monasteries on the top of them. And so, by elevator and by rope, they would slowly build these monasteries up on top of these high rocks. And they built a whole life up there with very interesting manuscripts and icons and mosaics that they beautified their life with. It's also an interesting opportunity to think upon the monastic tradition and to think about, it's often happened in Christian history, those who would desire to isolate themselves from the life of society, to engage not in the life of commerce and society as we have, but a life set apart. And it's interesting to see just that in contrast to the classical world, which saw man as a social creature, and that he who would not enter into society was idios, to oneself, the word that we get idiot from. And so, in opposition to, you might say, the rich interaction with society of classical Greek, you have this medieval period where isolation and separation from society was seen as the ideal. On day 9, we'll be driving down from northern Greece, from Meteora, and we'll be passing the site of Thermopylae. Here, this is the site of the great battle that was fought between the Spartans and the Persians, where the Persians did eventually defeat the Spartans, but the Spartans held their ground for such a long period and fought so valiantly that they frightened Xerxes tremendously. And now as we come down to Athens, we're not going to be staying in Athens this day, we're actually going to go off for a cruise. And this is a delightful way of finishing our trip, as so much of what we read in our Great Books experience is about ships and the water. You think of Odysseus' journeys through his adventures. Well, we're going to visit 3 lovely little islands. The islands we are going to see is the island of Poros. Then we'll be traveling on to the island of Idra, and finally Aegina, before we come back to Athens itself. Now, each of these islands is full of just beautifully quaint little villages, winding staircases, and a sort of quiet that you will have had nowhere else but on these little islands. And it really is a wonderful contrast to, well, at least life that we have here in Southern California, where we constantly have other people around. These islands are a very remote existence. And though there's, of course, villages on them, you really have a sense of isolation and being away that's very special. Also, just getting to travel across the water is an adventure in itself. To be plowing through the waves, thinking about yourself, and Odysseus getting from place to place over the surface of the water. This is a wonderful way to travel. And it's a very ancient way of traveling, and one that we don't use very often anymore. However, it is a wonderful way of reflecting on how many people have traveled this way in the past. All good things must come to an end, and on day 10 we will be returning to the United States. I hope this little tour has been a benefit to you in coming to understand some of the basic geography of many of the places that we study in great books.